and welcome to Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds, How America Culture Came to Be, the podcast of the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia. I'm Alex.
And I'm Rachel. March is Women's History Month, a month dedicated to the celebration and remembrance of the contributions of women to forming the United States. Originally in 1982, 1 week in March was designated Women's History Week by Congress. It wasn't until 1987 that Congress authorized President Reagan to declare the entire month of March as Women's History Month. Every year, museums around the country focus programming on topics pertaining to the role of women in American history. Last year was the centennial of the 19th Amendment, which was the culmination of over 70 years of the suffrage movement. But winning the right to vote isn't the only aspect of women's history that should be celebrated. There are many day-to-day aspects of women's history that kind of get lost in the shuffle. Michaela is here to tell us about one of them.
Welcome back to the show, Michaela.
Thanks, glad to be back.
So, today we're talking about midwifery and maternal health care for Women's History Month.
Yes, midwifery is my favorite topic to discuss at the museum. I've done multiple programs in the 1850s and 1760s houses on midwifery.
How would you define midwifery in the context we're speaking of?
Midwifery is a medical field most associated with fertility, female reproductive health, pregnancy, childbirth, and postpartum care. The first recorded midwife appears in the 5th century. Hippocrates was among the first to open midwife programs to his students. Female midwives of the past were usually familiar with herbal remedies known as simples, used by many housewives of the time. Midwives not only attended to expectant mothers, but also were local healers and sometimes morticians. They made house calls to anyone in the neighborhood in need of medical care. While most mothers were the primary caretakers of their own families, midwives honed a special set of skills and offered much of their time and experience to the community.
So midwives were fairly important to the community.
Yes, although midwives were not always looked upon with favor, they were often known as the butt of jokes and referred to as bawdy and ill-humored. Even worse, female midwives were sometimes accused of witchcraft due to their extensive herbal knowledge. In the Malleus Maleficarum, it states no one does more harm to the Catholic Church than midwives. More than likely, this stemmed from the idea that midwives were possibly knowledgeable in contraceptives and abortive medicines. Midwives in England were required to obtain a bishop's license to even practice. While these stereotypes persisted, female midwives continued to be leaders in their communities, and in fact it was one of the more respectable paid positions a woman could hold. In 1671, Jane Sharp became the first British woman to publish a midwifery manual. It is generally accepted that Sharp probably practiced midwifery over the course of 30 years. We do not know much of Jane's life, but Jane's manual, The Midwife's Book, or The Whole Art of Midwifery Discovered, has become a classic for anyone who studied the art of midwifery. Sharp instructs women on conception, pregnancy, and postpartum. The manual not only provides basic knowledge for a midwife, but it also provides detailed studies on anatomy and sexuality. Sharp writes, "We women have no more cause to be angry or ashamed of what nature has given us than men have. A woman is not so perfect as a man, but the man can do nothing without the woman to beget children." While Sharp specifically addresses females in her text, she also directs some of her phraseology towards male physicians, couples, and children. A few men tried to enter the profession from time to time, but it was generally viewed as indecent to have a man present in the birthing room. In the 1722 edition of the Virginia Gazette, male midwives were described as immoral, and this opinion stemmed from a persistent belief that maintaining women's health was a job divinely ordained for women.
So what did midwifery look like in colonial frontier America?
Midwifery was a trade just like blacksmithing or coopering. So when Europeans began settling parts of America, these new communities required midwives. So in the early years of settlement, some midwives were given a tract of land and even at times a stipend. Other forms of payment could include food, textiles, household necessities, or live animals like chickens or turkeys. On occasion, midwives traveled by canoe or horseback to reach their distant neighbors. One excellent resource on frontier midwives is a book by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich called A Midwife's Tale. Ulrich tracks the real diaries of Martha Ballard, a midwife in 18th and 19th century frontier Massachusetts, which is modern-day Maine. Unusual for her time, Ballard kept a record of her daily life as a midwife in the health records of her town of Halliwell. Ballard delivered over 816 babies in the 27 years she kept records and possibly was present over 1,000 births. Midwives in America, however, still face similar persecution they received back in Europe. In 1648, Margaret Jones was a midwife and the first person to be executed for witchcraft in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Margaret was one of many victims of a witch hunt that took place from 1648 to 1693. Some methods of collecting evidence against witches that were popular in the 17th century included pricking, a process of pricking a person's skin with needles or pins, sleep deprivation, and a swimming test which involved the infamous float and die method. Margaret, however, went through a process called watching. Several members of the community gathered to watch Margaret over a period of 24 hours. According to the legend, if a small creature or familiar appeared, the person was guilty. Unfortunately for Margaret, what was described as an imp, or probably just a neighborhood cat, was seen close to Margaret on the day of her watching, causing her to be guilty of witchcraft. Other evidence gathered against Margaret included that Margaret had, quote, a malignant touch. People were taken with deafness or vomiting or other violent pains or sickness, end quote. Margaret practiced, quote, physic and her medicines were harmless as aniseed, liquors, yet had extraordinary violent effects, end quote, and many others. Despite these hardships that midwives faced, America was still a place of hope for so many incoming immigrant midwives. Midwives and their families could own land and hopefully leave a lasting legacy for their children.
Were there any challenges for expectant European mothers in the colonies?
Yes, I shouldn't make it sound like rainbows and fuzzy kittens. Many of the first European settlers in America were indentured servants. In some cases, indentured servants were not allowed to marry until their contract with their masters were terminated. So if a woman was an indentured servant, her time to marry was in her late 20s, pushing the timeline to have children into her early 30s. While this doesn't seem like a problem in modern-day culture with so many women having children in their 30s and even 40s, life expectancy was at times shorter for women in the 17th and 18th centuries. Women on average gave birth to 5 children, losing one either to death in childbirth or miscarriage. Childbirth affected women's life expectancies, as they often faced death themselves. During the 17th and 18th centuries, between 1 and 1.5% of all births ended in the mother's death. Diseases were also a huge factor in early American life. In a previous episode on this podcast, I covered the topic of malaria. Malaria especially threatens pregnant women and those with weak immunological systems. The disease impedes reproductive health and can cause spontaneous abortions. Many women in the 17th century fell prey to malaria, causing issues in family development that led to labor shortages. African slavery, unfortunately, became the solution to these problems. I mentioned more about African slavery in our episode about malaria, but Africans were generally thought to be immune to malaria. So African midwives were brought to the colonies to become wet nurses to white babies.
What can you tell us about midwives and maternal care in more marginalized groups such as the Igbo and the Eastern Woodland Indians?
So with both groups, unfortunately, scholars do not have extensive knowledge on the topic. Neither the Igbo nor the Eastern Woodland Indians have a written history, so historians rely on archaeological evidence, culturally biased European accounts, and oral history. Also, when it comes to medicine, both the Igbo and Eastern Woodland Indians depended on traditional herbal medicines and religious practices. For the Igbo, the creator god Chineke formed the female body to give life. For an Igbo woman, the most important role is to have children, many children. Igbo usually married multiple women at a time to have more children. Igbo women took determined measures to have children, and if she did have a child, her life was fulfilled. Also, in Chinua Achebe's acclaimed novel, Things Fall Apart, we learned that in Igbo culture, having twins was seen as an evil sign. Twins were put in earthen pots and thrown away in the forest.
Does the nature of their maternal care change when they're forcibly brought to the colonies?
Yes and no. While Igbo did not lose their knowledge and culture, they did lose access to their familiarities and traditional herbs and plants. African men were usually on average brought in larger numbers to North America than women. Customarily, African women who were forcibly brought were between the ages of 12 to 15. These young women would have had little to no experience with childbirth, therefore leading a gap of midwifery knowledge. So in the years of American slavery, many enslaved mothers counted on white midwives to attend their births. As enslaved mothers passed down their knowledge to their daughters, enslaved midwives for white mothers became more popular in the 19th century. Many of the enslaved midwifery skills were a mixed bag of African, Caribbean, European, and Native American traditions. We know these enslaved midwives and wet nurses today as grannies or the more stereotyped mammies. Biddy Mason, also known as Auntie Mason or Grandma Mason, was one of these women. Biddy was born into slavery in 1818. Like many enslaved women, Biddy learned the arts of herbal medicine and midwifery from other female slaves. Biddy was forcibly taken from her parents and moved to another plantation at a very young age. Around the 1840s, Biddy was sold or either given again to a Robert Mays Smith and his new bride, Rebecca Dorn Smith. The Smiths moved multiple times but eventually ended up in California. California was considered a free state, which meant that any slave living in California or born there was free. But Smith refused to free Biddy. He then stated that the family was moving to Texas and that he would free Biddy there. Biddy did not believe Smith, so Biddy spoke to some free black men, Charles Owens and Manuel Pepper. With Owens and Pepper's assistance, Mason managed to gain her freedom through the court of law. Biddy moved to Los Angeles and took a job as a nurse and midwife. She assisted in hundreds of deliveries and also risked her life to care for the sick during the smallpox epidemic in Los Angeles. Mason was one of the first African American women to own land in Los Angeles, and she later became a successful businesswoman. She gave to several charities, including helping establish the first elementary school for black children in L.A. Mason died in 1891, but her legacy still remains today.
Did any of these enslaved midwives receive compensation?
Some did. In 1777, for example, Thomas Jefferson paid a, quote, Negro granny, end quote, at his Elk Island farm. Another example, an enslaved woman named Kate requested from George Washington to be paid for her midwifery services. Kate was an overseer's wife, and often overseers' wives assumed the role of the plantation midwife. Kate, along with many other enslaved midwives, including Jane, Old Peg, and Nell, were paid by Washington for their services. However, white midwives were paid almost twice as much as enslaved midwives, and many slaveholders viewed the service as a rental and therefore pocketed the money the enslaved midwives received.
And what of the Eastern Woodlands Indians?
The Eastern Woodland Indians' traditions I will describe were observed by various 17th century Europeans, so remember these biased sources might not always be reliable. The European colonizers observed that Mohawk women sought solitude in temporary shelters during delivery. Men never attended the births, and women often gave birth standing up or kneeling. The European settlers also noted that these women seemed to have painless births, but more than likely this was merely a cultural misconception and also possibly that these men just didn't understand female health. Furthermore, pregnant indigenous women were known to have restricted diets. For example, Cherokee women avoided eating pheasant and raccoon during pregnancy.
So, Michaela, I know you've done some extensive research into this topic, and you have found some pretty, shall we say, curious information. Would you like to share some of these discoveries?
Yes, I read a variety of 17th, 18th, and 19th century textbooks and pamphlets on the subject of female healthcare, midwifery, motherhood, and childcare. While most of these texts have benign theories on maternal care, I have a few favorites that are more unusual. Nicholas Culpeper noted in his book Complete Midwife Guide some signs of conception: giddiness, dimness of the eyes, and loose eyebrows.
What does that even mean?
I have no idea. And John Marbury's female physician, he postulated newborn infants be fed sweetened wine, or that the breast of some other clean and sound woman may be given the child until the mother's milk be purified. The book Midwifery by Horton Howard has advice for mothers in labor who feel any doubt whether her labor is really approaching. She may take occasionally a dose of the anodyne powders, cayenne, or any other article recommended to regulate the pains of labor, sitting by the fire to promote perspiration. Manual for Wives and Mothers, published in 1879, lists instructions for young wives and expecting mothers on topics such as fashion, exercise, diet, and even ventilation, saying contagious diseases are bred and fed in badly ventilated houses. Ill ventilated are hotbeds of disease.
Not too different what they say about COVID-19 today.
Right. They had a few correct ideas. For example, the manual instructs pregnant women to have bland meals, probably to settle their morning sickness symptoms. The author suggests abstaining from alcohol and eating broth, fruits, rice, and fish. However, some of the remedies prescribed weren't always the best. The manual includes remedies such as black tea, which contains caffeine, and powdered opium.
Not exactly the healthiest of remedies.
No, but the author does describe several important medical advances. For example, the author emphasizes the importance of chloroform, also known as twilight sleep, for women who are in labor. Queen Victoria was a huge lover of chloroform during birth, calling it that blessed chloroform. He also speaks to breastfeeding mothers, saying, "A mother ought not, unless she intends to devote herself to her baby, to undertake to suckle him. She must make up her mind to forego the so-called pleasures of a fashionable life." Of course, there are lots of superstitions surrounding pregnancy as well. The Germans believe a woman should wear her husband's slippers during labor and also wear a regular belt instead of rope for an easier birth. German women also should not be left alone for 6 weeks after birth for fear of the devil taking the woman's soul. Many early Europeans believed in changelings. According to the legend, if a woman gives birth to a baby that exhibits strange behavior or has deformities, the baby is a changeling. A changeling is an evil entity that a fairy or elf switched out with your own baby. The mother would then place the changeling in the woods overnight in hopes that the fairy or elf would switch the babies back. The babies often died due to neglect. We know today that these changelings were usually cases of children born with cerebral palsy or other health conditions, and people of the past merely were victims of lack of medical knowledge and modern science.
So today we have a variety of male and female doctors who attend births alongside midwives and doulas. When does that shift occur?
There was a strong divide, as I mentioned before, between men and women in the medical profession. Women were generally accepted as midwives, and men were physicians, apothecaries, and surgeons. However, in the late 18th and early 19th century, male physicians began dominating the birthing room. Male physicians were expensive, so mainly the upper class were able to afford male physicians to deliver their children. The trend of having male physicians then became more of a flaunt of wealth. One of these first prominent male midwives in Britain, William Smellie, was credited with developing the obstetrical forceps and establishing safe delivery methods. Smellie demonstrated to medical students and other midwives while performing free deliveries for women. While Smellie got a lot of criticism from the female-dominated midwifery community, Smellie continued to shift the work of midwifery from folk medicine to a professional medical field. However, the stigma surrounding male obstetricians were still considered to be ungentlemanly work. By the late 19th century, male doctors were generally accepted, especially with a push for midwives to become certified. Childbirth was viewed more as a surgical practice or hospitalized procedure. Women were not often admitted into medical school, leaving many women out of the medical profession. Some women were admitted to the nursing profession, which was an accepted female occupation at the time. Two English sisters, known as Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell, achieved becoming America's first and third certified women medical doctors. Elizabeth longed to become a doctor throughout her early life, but she received some backlash from friends and family, including Harriet Beecher Stowe. Elizabeth Blackwell went through egregious pains to be accepted at a medical school. She eventually applied and received her diploma at Geneva College. Elizabeth once said, "The idea of winning a doctor's degree gradually assumed the aspect of a great moral struggle, and the moral fight possessed immense attraction for me." Emily eventually followed in her sister's footsteps and received her diploma as well. Elizabeth worked in European clinics where she studied midwifery. Emily and Elizabeth later joined together and opened an infirmary for women and children in 1857. Elizabeth campaigned for many years for more women to enter the medical field. She eventually opened a women's medical school in New York in 1868. Elizabeth published several books on the subjects of hygiene, family planning, and medical education. Because of Elizabeth's tireless effort to support women, many prominent medical figures accepted women into the medical field. In 1881, there were only 25 female doctors registered to practice in England, but by 1911 there are 495. However, we do not see a huge spike in female midwives again until the 1950s. A mortality crisis occurred in the 1920s to 1930s, where pregnancy-related deaths were more than 15% of all deaths for women aged 15 to 44. Poverty, malnutrition, excessive use of surgical intervention, and lack of clean sanitation in the home and hospital contributed to these high rates. So a woman named Mary Breckinridge, founder of the Frontier Nursing Service, brought back familiar practices to save mothers and their babies by sending out nurse midwives on horseback in the Appalachian Mountains. If you're familiar with the PBS show called The Midwife, many medical boards began providing medical services to lower income or rural communities. Much of the folk medicine known before had been lost, but thanks to many granny midwives in African American communities, they still possessed the knowledge that was passed down from generation to generation. By 1950, Britain had 10,000 district nurses and midwives, and the American College of Nursing Midwives was created. Interest in midwives have risen over the past 35 years. In 2013, a midwife was present at 8.2% of births in the United States. Throughout history, the profession of midwifery has played a key role in empowering women and providing a support system for women across the globe.
Well, thank you for being on the show again, Michaela. We hope to hear more in the future about your findings and research on the topic of midwifery. We hope you enjoy Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds. We bring you historical episodes twice a month. You can check out the Frontier Culture Museum on frontiermuseum.org or Facebook and Instagram. You'll find background information on all the farms at the museum, information on oncoming events, and so much more.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please consider visiting the website and clicking the donate button. Donations to the Frontier Culture Museum Foundation support field trips, summer camp, and special events. We greatly appreciate it. See you next time.